The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our REMI guest webinar titled Mental Health in the Wealth of Regions. I am Brian Reel, Marketing and Event Coordinator at REMI. I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers from Region 1 Planning Council, Jason Holcomb and Rashad Pierre. Jason is the Director of Community Impact at Region 1 Planning Council and manages operations of the Winnebago County Community Mental Health Board. Rashad is a data analyst at Region 1 Planning Council and is focused on topics like model building, proofwriting, statistics, and performing calculations. At any time during this webinar, you can ask questions in the question box. And time permitting, I will moderate these questions with Rashad and Jason after the presentation concludes. Shortly after the conclusion of the presentation, I will also send a link containing the slides and a recording of this webinar to your emails for your reference. Thank you again for joining us for this presentation. Thank you to Jason and Rashad for taking the time to do the presentation, and take it away, Jason.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. And my name, as Brian mentioned, is Jason Holcomb. I'm the Director of Community Impact for Region 1 Planning Council in the Northern Illinois area, located in Rockford, Illinois. Community impact is the idea of addressing community problems at the level of community conditions. And so when we do that, when we're looking at that community-wide impact, sometimes we want to understand what that economic impact for our region is going to be as well. And REMI's been a great tool for us in modeling some of those economic impacts. So maybe you're wondering, maybe you signed up today wondering, what exactly does mental health have to do with economic development or economic impact? And really, that's kind of our question, which is there a relationship between mental health and economic impact or workforce? And really more specifically, one of our framing questions for this analysis is, do we believe there's a relationship between mental health and labor force productivity? And then secondly, if we believe there is, what is the scale of that issue or that problem or that impact? And lastly, if it's an issue that has a negative impact, what could be some of the potential mitigation strategies to recover some labor force productivity? In the late 90s, there were a group of mostly Canadian researchers that published a cluster of articles focused on developmental health, really looking at developmental health as we shift from a primarily industrial economy to a primarily knowledge economy. And one of their hypotheses were that nations that had the best developmental health infrastructure would be the ones that would have the necessary human capital to see the greatest economic growth as economies shifted towards more of a knowledge economy. One of the things that they could not possibly have predicted in the late 90s was what happened in 2007. And in 2007, we saw the first iPhone released. We saw Facebook go from a college platform for college users only to a general public population use, and we saw Twitter be introduced to the market. Now think about the impact of those three things alone, not to mention the Great Recession beginning around that time as well, but the impact of social media and the iPhone, having a handheld computer in your hand, and how that impacted the way we communicate with one another and the way that we exchange information, and also the way that we have used that in each of our industries. Unfortunately, epidemiologists have also looked at that 2007 mark as a critical benchmark and show some pretty troubling trends since 2007 as it relates to youth mental health. That's a moment in time where there seems to be an uptick of youth mental health disorders. Worldwide, we know that about 10 to 20% of children across the entire world are experiencing mental illness or mental health issues. And we know that for adults that have serious mental illness, 50% of that was onset by age 14 and 75% of it by age 20. So we know those late years of adolescence and early years of adulthood are critical for the lifetime impacts of mental health on an individual. As you might predict, some of the, I don't know if it's fair to say post-COVID research, but I would say COVID era research suggests that at least during the time of the pandemic, that mental health has been worsening across most age categories, but particularly for youth. But on a positive note, research has also demonstrated that there can be a very high return on investment when there are programs for youth that promote strong mental health. So just keep that in mind, and I'm not going to try to draw too many lines of causality through this because I know these are independent bodies of research. But when we look now at kind of the COVID era as well, and we look at the economic impact, we see that there were some very intense declines in labor force productivity. In fact, we saw the worst decline in labor force productivity since 1947, and nearly twice as large as any previous decline. And at the same time, we saw compensation per labor force or per unit of labor go up. So some have suggested, and this research demonstrates that compensation actually kept pretty good pace with inflation, but that labor force productivity was still weakened overall during that COVID pandemic era. So kind of getting back to that initial question I asked. So, okay, we know there's a lot of things that impact labor force productivity, and we certainly know there were a lot of things from supply chain to a number of other factors that affected that COVID area and industry output and labor force productivity during the COVID era, and still have. But what about the role of mental health in all of this? There's a recent working paper series, and one of the articles in that from 2022 took a look at cognitive endurance as this sort of construct for how people sustain mental effort over a continuous period of time. And one of the things that they found was that cognitive fatigue, which would be, in this case, the inability to sustain effort mentally over a continuous period of time, was so the cognitive fatigue happened much more quickly for lower income people in the study than it did for higher income. But more specifically, what they were able to identify is that it had to do with the types of schools that lower income students were in, having less opportunities to practice thinking for continuous stretches. So in an experimental study of 1,600 Indian primary school students, one of the things they were able to do was both test out cognitive practice versus a control group, meaning very intentional practicing of maintaining mental effort over a continuous period of time. And then also they had certain games that were geared at testing and increasing cognitive endurance, and math activities also kind of compared to a control group. And what they found was that students show about a 22% less decline in performance over time when they are engaged in intellectual activities. And so this includes listening comprehension, academic problems, or IQ tests. Those are all improved as a result of being in one of these experimental groups. And they also showed that there's an increased attentiveness in the classroom and higher scores on psychological measures of sustained attention. So kind of the takeaway from this article was that experience of effortful and intentional thinking itself is demonstrates an ability to increase traditional human capital. One of the things just maybe of note and interest is that they found that cognitive endurance is not fixed and it can be improved through practice, as I mentioned, but specifically that incentives were not, did not show a strong ability to increase performance. So cognitive endurance did not have a direct relationship with any type of incentives, but more with just these meaningful, effortful thinking exercises. So, you know, a lot of this research I'm talking about is very youth focused, and you might be thinking, okay, so is this just a problem of young people that we're talking about? Well, in that same working paper series, there was another study done kind of looking at different age cohorts and examining this idea of the midlife crisis that we all have heard about, this another type of construct. And they were testing to see does that construct have any validity? And one of the things that they found, and you'll see on these, each one of these arcs in the graph, that there is an actual kind of bell curve that peaks somewhere in that range of 35 to 54 related to depression, anxiety disorder, and feelings that life is not worth living. So we see that it's not just a problem, this kind of uptick in mental health issues is not simply a problem of the youth, but we do see that it can have lifelong impacts and can even have more upticks in that middle age period of time when people might be taking on more responsibilities at work, might be in greater management roles, they might be balancing more at-home responsibilities and trying to balance those with a healthy work-home life balance. So one of the things when we were kind of putting together this study and analysis was the question of, is this a labor productivity? So if we're thinking of mental health as having an impact on workforce, is that a labor force productivity issue, or is that a labor force participation issue? I come from the disability sector, and I certainly have worked with a lot of people who have been coming out of work, who have either been not able to sustain gainful activity and who have filed for disability for various reasons, both mental health and physical health issues. And one of the things that, you know, not just anecdotally, but data demonstrates when you look at the numbers of people who file for Social Security disability is that generally when the economy is doing pretty well and there's a tight tight job market, that Social Security applications go down, and the inverse of that is true as well. When there is a poor economy and there's high unemployment, you see the number of disability applications go up significantly. And so I'm framing that when we're talking about this issue of quiet quitting that has become this buzz phrase more recently, and particularly during the COVID era. And a lot of people have looked at this issue of quiet quitting and postulated a number of theories, including that it could be a function of poor management. So looking at this kind of principal agent model where the boss has to kind of incentivize and keep engaged the worker, and the worker has to do the job, but they're both self-interested, and there's a really, especially in the service sector or knowledge economy type work, that it can be very hard to monitor productivity. And then there's been some more macro theories that this is maybe kind of this quiet fleecing idea where, or a response to quiet fleecing, where it's really a bounce back from years of workers not receiving all of the economic benefit of increased productivity. And I think these are certainly interesting theories, but what some of the research that we've already addressed has kind of demonstrated is that wages have outpaced productivity increases, or in this case, there's been productivity declines, while wages have gone up for the last several years. And in some cases, again, the research suggests that on the whole, wages are maybe keeping up with inflation. So, so I don't know that quiet fleecing thing, I'm sure there's a lot more to that, right? I might be just giving kind of a layman's understanding of it, but we have some evidence that maybe suggests there might be something more complex going on, is what I'll say. And so one of the questions we have is it maybe possible that cognitive endurance plays a role in this as well? When we think about all of the additional pressures of functioning during a pandemic, and we know that the research is showing increased mental health issues, is it possible that people are not able to sustain the same level of mental activity throughout a workday that maybe they had in past years? And so there's some research that was been done on college students, because this idea of quiet quitting is showing up in the college campus as well. We see that 34% of students surveyed in this particular study admitted that they are not going above and beyond in their classes, and 6 in 10 students agreed with the statement that C's get degrees. 64% also said that they put less energy into an online class than an in-person class. But when you look at the chart to the left there, you see that very few students said that grades don't matter. And in fact, 75% of students that were surveyed somewhat or strongly believed that their GPA would have an impact on the type of job that they got after graduation. So they haven't stopped believing in the idea of grades or the importance of that. But when you look at the farthest left end of that chart, you see that their number one reason for not going above and beyond is that they've had mental and physical health issues. So again, this kind of contributes to this question of, does cognitive endurance itself play a role in this reduced labor force productivity, or in this case, even productivity within a college classroom setting? And then if we take that into the healthcare sector specifically, which arguably might be the most negatively impacted by the issues of COVID, if we're talking about stress levels and emotional exhaustion, and we see that there's some significant research to show increased emotional exhaustion across almost every type of position within the field of healthcare during that COVID era. And if we do see a little bit of variation in physicians themselves, where the emotional exhaustion actually decreased in 2020, but then bounced back in more recent years. And you see in general from 2019 to 2022, there's this trend of increasing emotional exhaustion across all healthcare workers. And so finally, as we just look at this kind of macro level view of mental health, there's been a lot of recent analysis and systematic reviews of the role of medications in mental health treatment. Really because for many years, the FDA only required pharmaceutical companies to publish controlled trials that showed the effectiveness of their medications. So now researchers are looking to see, well, what did all the other studies show that maybe weren't published, and what is the true effectiveness of some of this medication? And so without getting too far into the weeds, in this more recent study published in 2022, it was estimated that SSRIs, which are generally used to treat depression and are widely used, 1 in 8 Americans are actually prescribed SSRIs, that from a research standpoint might only be effective for about 15% of those who use them. And so that's, again, not to say that they shouldn't be part of a mental health treatment protocol and that they will certainly be effective for many people. But I guess the point is that if it's true that we have this increasing amount of mental health issues, it's unlikely that we will be able to medicate ourselves out of the problem. So we will have to look at additional types of supports to address this. So just briefly, I want to get back to this research question, or this kind of hypothesis, this question of inquiry that we started off on. Is there a relationship between mental health and labor force productivity? Based on the research, probably yes. Through the specific construct of cognitive endurance, there's what in the medical field you might call a biological plausibility. It's not just conceptual, it's not just connecting data, but there's a biological mechanism through which we can say that increased mental health symptoms probably reduce cognitive endurance, which probably has an impact on the ability to sustain meaningful activity throughout a workday. Secondly, what is the scale of the problem? Well, we know the scale is pretty big because about 20% of people have a diagnosable mental health disorder, and we know that the problem is likely getting worse when we look at those trend lines. So it's a large scale problem. And lastly, what are some potential strategies that might mitigate this to help us recover or prevent some additional lost labor force productivity? And so I'd like to tell you just briefly about something we're doing in Winnebago County, in which voters in 2020 passed a half-cent sales tax for mental health. And if you look at a survey of key informants from 2019 conducted by a local research university, you'll see that even their workforce within the mental health field itself was noted as one of the major issues for why mental health services had such shortage. So you kind of get into that meta layer there, where the workforce in one industry may have an impact then on workforce across all industries. So with that half-cent sales tax in the first year of funding, you can just kind of see the different types of focus areas. From an $8 million grant allocation, you see that mental health treatment, kind of those traditional components of mental health treatment like psychiatric medication and diagnosis, and then supportive counseling got a big bulk of that, followed by crisis response services, which is, you know, when somebody is experiencing suicidal ideation or some type of other symptoms that might be a harm to themselves or others, who comes out and responds and where do they go? And then case management, and lastly, family and community services. This is an interesting part of it, though, when we look at the job creation from that. So that funding created 80 new jobs in the mental health sector in Winnebago County. And after about 1 year of that funding, 65 of those had been filled, and the remaining 16 jobs were still not filled because of the workforce shortages that I alluded to in the mental health sector. And then if you look at numbers served, I show you this just to kind of give you an idea of the scope of what that funding does. So Winnebago County is about 280,000 roughly in population size, and in the first year of funding, we see that 2,000 unduplicated were served in that fourth quarter. So that's kind of, and we've now exceeded that in this next year of funding to get to where really on a quarterly basis, 1% of the population is being served with mental health services specifically from this tax. And then another thing we're able to do with a local fund is break down and be specific about the target populations we want to reach and make sure that there's equitable distribution in the services. So we look at demographics of the numbers served by race, and you'll see some diversity there. We can look at it by geographic distribution. So again, as those of you who are now using SEI, you can think about that kind of way of connecting who we intend to serve, and then what that might look like on an economic impact. And then lastly, age. And if you remember some of that earlier research, I talked about 50% of mental health being onset by age 14 and 75% by age 20, you see why we have that really large arc right there at late adolescence and early 20s, although we don't have that same thing at that midlife crisis period of time. So that's something that might be looking to address in the future. So I'm going to hand it over to our data analyst in just a moment, Rashad Pierre, who really was the one that ran the numbers on this particular analysis for us. But I did want to just frame that by saying there was a fourth question, after we talk about, okay, so what is the impact and what are some of our potential mitigation strategies? Then we kind of want to know what is if we know a dollar amount that we're investing in mental health here, what do we think are the dollar amounts that we might see in recovered labor force productivity if our hypothesis is correct that that we can impact that through increasing mental health. So it's a bit of a conceptual model. I'm going to turn over to Rashad and he can walk you through some of the scenarios that we ran.
Hello there, my name is Rashad Pierre. I'm a data analyst at Region 1. I assisted in developing the model. This model was developed in REMI via Transite and focused primarily on Winnebago County. And this model proposes the question, if there's a labor productivity decrease nationwide, how would Winnebago County be able to mitigate it? Jason, if you go to the next slide. Thank you. Here, you can see that we have a REMI baseline compared to two separate baselines, an industry output of 5% labor productivity decrease and an industry output with a 10% labor productivity decrease. Industry output is defined by REMI as measured by the amount of production, including all intermediate goods purchased as well as value added, competition, and profit, and can also be thought as a sales or supply. The components of output are self-supply and exports, which can be multi-regions, rest of the nation, and rest of the world. The following, in the next few slides, is going to be measured in billions. And labor productivity is output divided by employment output per employee. Jason, could you go back to the previous slide? I wasn't done explaining it. But to get a gist of what our industry output looks like, the standard regional control for Winnebago County has an industry output of 27 billion in 2023 and 71 billion by 2080. Labor productivity at -5% will have an industry output of 26.3 billion in 2023 and a 69.3 billion by 2080. Labor productivity at -10% will have an industry output of 25.5 billion in 2023 and 67 billion by 2080. The value lost in the 5% decrease is $802 million in 2023 and $2.2 billion by 2080. The value lost in the 10% decrease is 1.6 billion in 2023 and 4.4 billion by 2080. The inputs that you currently see are the inputs that we use for our presentation. We've created 7 separate scenarios. These are our first two. For our first two, we have created a national baseline with a 5% decrease in labor productivity, as you recall before, from the years of 2023 to 2080. The first scenario we focus on is a 1% mitigation for the baseline. And for the second scenario, we created a 5% mitigation for the baseline. Within these first two scenarios, we measure industry output. So as you can see, these are our graph. The 1% mitigation with a 5% decrease yields an industry output recovery of $67 million in 2023 and $373 million by 2080. The 5% mitigation with a 5% decrease yields an industry output recovery of $328 million in 2023 and a $1.8 billion by 2080. For our third and fourth scenario, we developed a national baseline with a 10% labor productivity decrease from the years of 2023 to 2080. Our following scenarios are similar to our previous scenarios in that the third scenario had a 1% mitigation for the newly developed baseline, and the fourth scenario had a 5% mitigation for the baseline. The 1% mitigation with a 10% decrease yields an industry output recovery of 64 million in 2023 and 359 million by 2080. The 5% mitigation with a 10% decrease yields an industry output recovery of 316 million in 2023 and 1.8 billion by 2080. Our fifth scenario is very different. The inputs displayed here are inputs regarding the employment in relation to the mental health tax. This is our fifth scenario. This scenario was developed with Region 1 planning, where we predicted the number of jobs that would be developed due to the mental health tax. With these new inputs, we applied them to the standard regional control and REMI. In this scenario, we looked at industries that were affected indirectly. Industries that benefited the most indirectly was state and local government, with 9 new jobs being created by 2032, and the industries that benefited the least was nursing and residential care facilities, ambulatory health care services, and private households, with all tied for 1 job being lost by 2032. And for our final scenarios, 6 and 7, we accounted for labor intensivity. Within our previous scenarios, we discovered that employment had been decreasing alongside labor productivity, and in this final scenario, we toggled the labor intensity effect option. For these scenarios, we measure employment instead of industry output. So we're measuring people being employed rather than money being made. Within this scenario, we applied the 1% and 5% mitigation to the 5% decrease while having the labor intensity option toggled. The industry that benefited the most in this scenario was administrative and support services, and the industry that benefited the least from this change was pipeline transportation. At a 1% mitigation, administrative and support services will receive an increase from 10,886 people employed in 2023 to 17,864 people employed by 2080. Pipeline transportation remains at a 1 job increase from 2023 to 2080. At a 5% mitigation, administrative and supportive services had a 10,779 people employed in 2023 to 17,600 people being employed by 2080. Pipeline transportation remained the same, and to note, labor intensity assisted in the employment increase for the 1% mitigation, but it had little to no effect on the 5% mitigation. In fact, in some cases, it had a decrease in employment for some of our industries. And that is our model.
Thanks, Rashad. So I know it's a lot of information. Maybe you're processing this, but maybe you're also wondering, so what is the actual application of this? If we believe these things to be true, that mental health has this potential to impact labor force productivity, what do we do about it? What do employers do about it? What do people in economic development do about it? Or maybe how do we think about, how does it frame our conversations about the future of workforce? Are there any industry leaders who are already using this type of approach? And there's one industry where you might find this approach that you might not really be looking for or necessarily think about, and that's actually in baseball. So in competitive sports, if you see the picture there and you're a baseball fan, especially if you play fantasy baseball, you probably know that's Brad Pitt playing Billy Beane in the movie Moneyball. And Moneyball was all about the use of data analytics in baseball to find these market inefficiencies in finding players who were undervalued, but through a data analytics perspective actually contributed more towards winning a game than what they were being valued at, because people were just looking at too many baseball cards and thought the statistics on the back of the baseball card were the most important ones. And then again, if you follow baseball, you know that Theo Epstein has become kind of the new improved Billy Beane, and also known as the curse breaker, who brought a world championship to the Boston Red Sox and also to the Chicago Cubs. And Theo Epstein kind of took the ideas of identifying market inefficiencies to the next level. And what Theo did was, even in his time at Boston, he teamed up with neuroscientists and started to analyze the neurocognitive components of good hitting or good fielding. And they used that to try to architect a team that, even if they didn't on a statistical analysis basis find a market inefficiency, that they could create their own market inefficiency by taking an undervalued player and essentially training them through these very intentional methods to become better hitters. And I think anyone, again, that follows baseball knows that there's really no one better in the business in the period of time that Theo Epstein was managing his teams, for the number of all-stars that they had, the number of low draft picks or undrafted players that made it to high states. So it was an incredibly effective thing. And of course, I think sports science is a large industry now, and those types of components are used across multiple types of competitive sports, where you're really taking a neuro-informed approach to workforce development. That's what it is. And I don't know that we've seen that at the same scale necessarily in more of our kind of day-to-day traditional type of workplaces, but I think that that is a place to explore what the future of workforce would look like because of the enormous economic impact, positive or negative, that mental health can have. And here's our references for those that want to maybe uncover a little bit more of the research and come up with some of your own ideas. And with that, we will certainly take some questions if anybody has one.
Great. Thank you for the great presentation, Jason Rashad. Like was just said, we're about to get into the question portion. So if you have any questions about this presentation, you can put them in the box right now. I will moderate them. And if you have any questions about REMI, please reach out to info@remi.com and I'll direct your questions to the correct person. So we got a couple questions. So the first one being, will we get the slides in the recording of this webinar? Yes, like I said, in about an hour, those will be emailed to you, so for your reference. We had a question, Jason Rashad, about getting your contact information to follow up with based on their work. We can talk about that further, about putting that in the email I'm going to send out with the slides in the recording.
Yeah, Brian, and just to appreciate that, but we'd be happy to hear what other people are doing and learn and share information where it can improve, both of our types of analyses. We love hearing what other people do, and one of the great things about the REMI user conference every year is being able to have that exchange of ideas.
And it looks like there are no current questions. We can wait a minute or two to see if anything comes in, but okay, it looks like one just came in. So is there any concern about extrapolating 60 years out using only a small amount of data?
I mean, certainly we wouldn't necessarily say that there's going to be every year for 60 years the guarantee of that type of percentages of mitigation. But I think what we're really looking for is just building a conceptual model that can kind of help us understand where the relationships between mental health and labor force productivity are, so that we can we could create any number of scenarios that look at a shorter period of time that have larger or lower percentages. And as we collect actual data on numbers served and other types of outcomes from funded programs over the course of a period of time, it gives us more intelligence about what those realistic ideas are about what our estimates should be. So I think that's a fair question, certainly. I don't not saying that with 100% accuracy, this is how it's going to play out, but more of just an idea of what is the scale of this, you know, and a low end and to a high end, what could be the economic impact? Is it something we should really be caring
But, with that, like I said, if you have any questions that anybody has, you can feel free to reach out to info@remi.com, and I can also forward those along to Jason. But it looks like we also just got another question. So do you know if there were any political implications or pushback regarding the implementation of the sales tax in the county?
I wasn't directly involved in the campaign. I know there was a committee that formed to advocate for that, but this had 65% voter approval, so it was well supported by most of the community, and it continues to be supported by most of the residents and leadership of the community.
It looks like, well, somebody had some input that the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce has approached this from a brain science perspective, specifically on the effects of toxic stress and trauma on workers and on workforce development participants. The brain science findings match up with your economic findings, so that is very interesting.
Thank you. Which company did you say, or which organization had been looking at that, or corporation?
Corporation for a Skilled Workforce, CSW.
Oh, thanks. I'm going to write that down.
Great. Thank you for everybody who attended this webinar. Again, Rashad and Jason, thank you for the great and very insightful presentation. A copy of the slides and a recording will be sent to your emails very shortly. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.